Hello and welcome to a very spooky episode of The Modern Nerd. I am Sir Slice,
I'm merchandise.
I'm GJC.
and we are, as always, massive nerds. Or massive ghouls, whatever you want to go with on this wonderful spooky season going on. So today, obviously, we're going to be talking about what I'm calling our Halloween horror movies. Horror. Horror. That's hard to say.
There's some
In the
horrors in
theater
this house.
industry, we would say horror, just
Yeah.
so you're not think we're not saying whores.
There's some
Horror.
horrors in this house.
So-
Before we get into all of that, as usual, I'm going to give a nice shout out to Smirch and GJC here. Thank you very much for doing this with me. And all of you watching along, we appreciate you sticking with us for all these long hiatuses between episodes. And we appreciate you giving it a like and a follow. So go ahead and make sure you click that button wherever I decide to put that little graphic later. I'm going to point down and up because I don't know. But thank you again for all watching live and or on the YouTube channel over at The Modern Nerd on YouTube. So, today, we, my friends, are talking about horror movies.
For some reason, why everyone talks spooky, they become the Count from Sesame Street. I don't know. It's just
One
horror
This
movies.
falls across the land. The midnight hour is close at hand.
Everyone's the Count.
Okay.
Ah.
Before we dive into what we think horror movies should be and are, our opinions, again, opinions, full on opinions. These are not hard facts. This is how we feel about them. If you feel differently, please sign off in the comments. I want to know your opinions. We love hearing about different people's point of views on all kinds of movies. In this particular case, let's keep it to horror movies.
We actually mean it this time. We want to know.
Yeah, I do. I always mean it. Fuck you. So, Britannica.com, their definition of a horror movie says horror films may incorporate incidents of physical violence and psychological terror. They may be studies of deformed, disturbed, psychotic, or evil characters, stories of terrifying monsters or malevolent animals, or mystery thrillers that use atmosphere to build suspense. So, I mean, that covers a lot of what people would call, in our opinions, subgenres of horror movies, because there are a wide variety of things that could be considered horror movies. For example, I'm going to go over I'm going to just shout out right now a couple of subgenres, and then we're going to wind it back and talk about those genres a little bit. So we've got some psychological horrors, slasher films, monster movies, zombie films, sci-fi, paranormal, and then vampire and comedic, which I will love to spend a lot of time on because I think those are a very interesting subgenre and group of movies that we have there. But let's how do you guys kind of feel like where do you draw the line on horror movies before we dive deep into these thrillers and psychological mysteries and stuff?
It's funny. I would say that in terms of straight up horror movies, I would put myself forward as the biggest fan of horror between the three of us. And ironically enough, I'm looking at this list of psychological, slasher, monster, zombie, sci-fi, paranormal, comedic, and vampire. Maybe I'm not the biggest fan of horror. I definitely, to me, a horror movie is well, not what it is, but I love the paranormal kind. Hereditary, even the ones that aren't great, I still enjoy. Hereditary, Paranormal Activity, Exorcist. I guess Exorcist that might even fall into a subgenre of paranormal in terms of devil and exorcism type movies. But we won't touch that. But The Ring, oh my God, The Ring. And I think about the rest of these, and I don't particularly feel like sometimes. Okay, I guess I would define a movie as a horror movie is if it scares you. Now that doesn't mean that's what it means, but that's what it means to me. And the rest of these don't scare me at all. I have not been scared by any zombie movie, psychological, slasher, sci-fi. We'll get into that later. I would say yes for some of the sci-fi movies.
Big time.
But vampire, and I think this because there's sci-fi, there's more unknown. And it's when something is completely unknown to you that adds a level of fear. But I definitely, it's scary movies are what I value, and paranormal and sci-fi, I guess now that I'm realizing both of them fall into we're not quite sure what you're dealing with, so that adds a level of horror, if you will. Love whenever there's a comedic element to anything, though. So,
Yeah. George, how do you feel about these? Where would you put your line, your definition?
I would say I'm on the one that likes horror the least, but in a very interesting way that kind of the flip side of Smirch is I appreciate horror subgenres. Some subgenres I love. Like I really enjoy the science fiction subgenre of horror. And we talked about like just before the show, we talked about things like TV shows like The Twilight Zone and like Outer Limits, Black Mirror, Love, Death, and Zombies and Robots or whatever, Love, Death, and Robots and things like that. Those are all very science fiction-y horror style like TV shows, and I love those little like miniseries and things like that. So there's parts of horror subgenres that I really enjoy, but the traditional like ghost and things like that, like or whatever, like slasher or things like that, they don't interest me. Like, you know, you could say Saw is also one, like those type of things. Not really like franchise. Not really my like that's not my bag, you know, like the murderer or whatever. That's like that doesn't scare me, nor does it like really interest me at all. You know what I'm saying? Like what people to think of stereotypical horror does not interest me. But like niches of it, like zombies. Like you got anyone who knows me knows I'm deathly scared of zombies. I'm pretty sure. I mean, it's a matter of time. All right, like COVID was just a test. Okay, like now you know. Now you know it was a prep. Like now you know. Yeah. Look, so like that's something that's plausible. And science fiction to me, maybe because of the fact that just my more logical and scientific brain, as opposed to like religious brain, I'm more willing to believe and be scared of that because I feel like that's more quote unquote realistic than like paranormal or even a murder. Like what are the chances an axe murder gonna like take me down in a city of millions? Like, come on, like even a serial killer, like, come on, like, so that doesn't scare me.
The truth of the matter is there's a lot of them out there. So yeah,
well,
maybe
like the odds are still in your favor, quote unquote, as opposed to like weird scientific shit. I just feel like, or like, yeah, like aliens or whatever, that type of scary scientific things like science fiction feels more realistic to me.
Yeah.
So I'm more scared of it. And I feel like zombies kind of fall into that too, because like zombies are usually typically, I mean, from a science fiction perspective.
Of like all of these categories, the two that are more likely to happen or in real world are like, I feel is obviously slashers, because that's just kind of usually like a murderer, a mass murderer. That clearly happens. And then for me, it is zombie movies. Like that could happen. Like that's not that far fetched. You know what I mean? Like, you know, like The Blob. I don't think so. That's not happening. You know what I mean? Like, but like other things are maybe possible. But it's funny that each of you have your own thing. I really do love the slasher films. Like they're not scary to me. Sometimes they are, because what slashers tend to do is they'll lean into either heavy on the gore, which is like a subgenre, or they go heavy onto like the suspense / jump scares, and they'll do that, and that's what, you know, for me is, I'm like, whoa, you know, it gets you on the edge of your seat, and then you got me, you son of a bitch.
I don't like that.
Anything. I don't. I mean, I do, but I don't. Like that's the whole thing. Like y'all know, I love going on haunted houses. Nobody goes with me, and everybody's like, "Nah, fuck you, I'm not going." I pulled you, GJC, one year, and you
make me go every year. You make me go every year, and it's the
when
worst.
I'm around. Yes, and you hate
I'm
it.
like,
I'm
no.
But like, I'm looking at this list. We compiled a list of things we're not going to all talk about, but there are about 50 movies in our subgenres. I've seen about 48 of these. So going into this, I'm sitting here going, every time someone's like, "Do you like horror movies?" and I'm like, "Man, apparently I do," because I've seen most of these, and actually I enjoy most of the movies on here, which I didn't think I would. I don't do all of them often. You know, I'm not sitting here like I'm gonna watch, you know, fucking Event Horizon all the time. I'm not gonna do that. That's just too much anxiety in my life. I don't need it.
No, I'm good.
But let's talk about it. Let's break it down a little bit. So psychological horrors are arguably at least some of my favorites as well. I know Dan, you love those a lot. George, I don't know if you love them, but I know you've seen a bunch of
I've
them with us.
seen the
But
big
like
ones.
some of the ones that we see that we've listed, just for examples, maybe Get Out, American Psycho, Silence of
Mhm.
the Lambs, Sixth Sense, Shining. I might even put like Shutter Island kind of in there, which has like it delves more into the psyche and everything of people and what's happening, and but it incorporates this amount of, I call them psychological thrillers. So they bring the anxiety, they bring the like wonder, they bring the like what is happening? Why is this person like slipping into madness? What is going on? That kind of stuff. That's how I kind of see psychological thrillers. Black Swan, that kind of stuff where there is an element of like they'll use the tropes for like the camera and building suspense and doing that, but it's mostly focused around like the characters in the movie and like their psyche and how that's going. How do you feel about, how do you look at psychological movies, Dan?
There, it's funny. We have a little list here, and what we have is Get Out, American Psycho, Silence of the Lambs, Sixth Sense, The Shining, Black Swan. These are arguably, if I had to pick in terms of quality of movies, this chunk right here, I think takes the cake.
They're all
above
like
the list.
Oscar.
These are psychological movies. There's a much larger canvas for these kinds of movies, and and that leaves more room for interpretation, not just from the director, but most importantly from the audience perspective, and leaves more, and because of that, if done well, the rewatchability gets really high, and you notice things you didn't notice before, and this is where true craftsmen of film can really shine and show how and show intricate details that sometimes may matter. Sometimes maybe they're pointed out later and they didn't even think about it. The audience, it's just the audience getting into the movie, and that's more of a testament to the filmmaker themselves. Psychological is, in my personal opinion, the quality and the blank canvas that is given to them is great. I personally like to know a little more, have a little bit more of a concrete, not so much leave like so many of these movies. I mean, The Shining, arguably the best of these, there's so much open to interpretation. And while I love that movie, there's a small part of me that kind of wants to know, like a lot of answers to a lot of questions in that movie. Would knowing like take away from the movie? Probably. So, do I really want it? I don't know, but that's how I feel.
I have a question for you. I'm going to dive into The Shining real quick. The year was 2014. No, I don't know. It was some year, like 8, 9, 10 years ago, and it was October 31st. And Timbo Slice gives Merchandise a phone call and says, "Hey, buddy, you want to go to a movie?" And you're like, "I don't know. What do you want to see?" And I was like, "The Shining is playing." And he says to me, "I've never seen that movie." And I go, "The fuck?" Like, and I went, "We're going to this movie," and you got excited, and we're like, "Cool." And so for you, your first experience of this movie was on the big screen. For me, my first experience was sitting at home with the lights off, and so would you say that being able to have that experience swayed your feel of the movie?
Yeah,
Like, do
I
you
would.
love that much more, or if you'd
I
watched it
think.
at home, would it have been like, yeah, it was good?
Well, I will say I watched it. I actually watched it very recently, just not a week and a half ago, and it's still very good. I do think. Seeing there is something about seeing a movie in a movie theater where you can't stop.
Sure.
You get immersed. I have always felt that way, and I think that continues to be the case. It's a good movie.
Yeah.
I mean,
I watch it every year.
I love picking up on things, and it's fun to talk about with your friends. Was he just there the entire time? Like, we never see him anywhere else except when he's driving there. I don't know. There's tons of questions that you can talk about and theories.
George,
It's a good movie.
How do you feel?
I would
about
say I kind of
psychological?
like riffing off of what Dan said earlier. I feel like he's right in the sense that, like, for me, a lot of the psychological movies have a larger audience, right? Like, it's much more accessible because it won't necessarily be presented to the audience and to a potential audience member as a horror film. You know what I'm saying? Therefore, like, because horror has such a large, typical stereotype of things, like people tend to who don't like horror will be like, okay, I don't want to watch it. But if you present a movie as more of a psychological thriller with elements of horror in it, I think it's much more palpable and much more accessible to people. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And a lot more, the audience is just that much wider. When in many ways, it's subversively a horror film.
Yeah. Like they definitely market these as like thrillers, which
Right.
makes people go, "Oh, okay, there's some intrigue to it."
Right,
Whereas
because
like
horror has that jump scare like
Yeah.
stereotype to it
People
that
think
people
of,
don't
like,
like.
Halloween and Friday the 13th,
Yeah,
and
that's not what
people
these movies are at
No.
all.
No.
Like I
They
mean,
may have
maybe
a
a
few
little bit,
here
but
and
like I'm
there,
trying to
but
think of a jump scare scene in some of these. Not like, I guess American
I mean
Psycho might have a little bit, but not really. Like,
Shining has a couple little ones. Nothing massive, but like, they're coming
yeah,
around the corner and he like, he
they're not
fucking
cheap. It's like
kills Scatman Crothers, like couple little things but that's not the focal point. You're
it
right.
doesn't make it feel like, I mean, maybe in a snobby kind of way, you're like, jump scares seem like a cheap thrill for like a moviegoer for a scary film, and this seems more somewhat like psychological, is like more mind bending and more a different type of ride, if you will, than a jump scare ride. And that's much more palpable and accessible to a larger audience. And that's why some of these I have seen, and it's much more in the psychological category for sure.
Yeah. And that's a nice little transition because slashers is what we got next on the list, which
Yeah.
is I love these movies, and it's not all of them scare me. I'm not going to say that they do, but like there's just something about some of these movies that I enjoy. I think the way you frame a shot, the way you are able to use very little dialogue and still make you feel something, because it is about the suspense in the moment. It's about building. It's about that kind of stuff, making you kind of be like, where is he? Who's about to get stabbed? And if you frame it wrong, if you shoot it wrong, you're just like, oh, I can see his foot, or something like that. Like it's just something is off if you don't shoot it right. So there is an art form to the slasher to make it good, because there are a lot, and I mean a lot, of really bad ones.
Oh, yeah.
But the ones that we have on this list, I feel, are cream of the crop because they are your main titles. You've got Psycho and Halloween, Scream, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street. There's probably others I'm forgetting, so please tell us if there's other slashers
In
that
the
you
comments.
enjoy that are good. Yes, in the comments. But like for me, the Halloween franchise, not all of them, don't get me wrong, but most of them I really do like, because at a point it was like, let's build on this lore, and then you're like, okay, you've gone too far, please stop. And then
Halloween in space.
yeah, I really liked the reboot by Rob Zombie, the first one. I thought that was an interesting take because he added like some psychological aspects to it about like background of the character. And then the new trilogy for Halloween I really liked as well, because what they did was basically they have timeline of the 1977 1973 Halloween, and then this new one that came out, this new trilogy, they're like, all those other movies didn't happen. And you pick up the first Halloween that we saw with Jamie Lee Curtis now, like 5 years ago, was technically Halloween 2.
That's so complicated.
So it is, but like it when you watch it, you're like, oh, this actually makes sense. If they had done this in the first place, this would have been, a lot better. But they're good. Like I just like the character. I love Jamie Lee Curtis. She's good in fucking everything. But I think Scream was another big one for me that I think redefined slasher and kind of expanded it, because it really did add like a little bit. That was like a Scooby-Doo type movie where it's like, who did it? Who's behind the mask? And it's it's good. How do you guys? I know you don't love them, but
it's interesting that this is following psychological, because at the end of the day, even you throw a little extra spice here and there. Basically, at the end of the day, these are just, with the exception of Nightmare on Elm Street, these are just it's a dude with a knife. And sorry, that doesn't typically interest me. It kind of like, it's just, oh, okay, it's a dude with a knife. Like, you have to add some psychological to it in order to make it interesting, because no matter what's happening, it's it's just a dude with a knife. I admit I have written off probably more than a couple of these because it just doesn't. I don't. There's so many, all the categories that follow this. It's not just more interesting from a creative standpoint. I would just rather see something more interesting than just like. I do appreciate from a horror perspective that to some people, a dude with a knife can be scarier because it's a little closer to home. It's more likely to happen, and that is inherently scary. I do understand that. I'm not one of those people. I want to see some otherworldly shit. I want to see something that we could never thought we would have seen.
I'm just thinking of that time when we were delivering pizzas and I almost pretty much stabbed you on accident. You're like, it couldn't happen. Get stabbed. Shit.
Tim, sometimes your friend's holding a knife and he turns around too fast. You know what I mean? This is how these things go. Nightmare on Elm Street. I don't know if I'd even put that's towing the line between I don't know some this and other ones, but I know that these movies have value. I've seen Psycho. It's hard for me to appreciate older movies, but I do know that it laid the groundwork for many movies to come. It's just the end of the day, I think I'd rather watch something a little more horrific.
Sure. George?
I saw that you put in there that I think Scream is very significant in the sense that it's kind of spawned a whole little mini genre of its own too. There were so many things that were like it, like I Know What You Did Last Summer. And also I would put even like there's tons of little like teeny bopper versions of Scream just under different franchise names that came out during that time.
Sure.
I can't think of them off the top of my head because they all didn't survive, but Scream is the only one that's still around.
I mean, Scream even got like a recent sort of.
That's what I'm talking
Obviously,
about.
there's new
It's a TV
movies,
show.
but like they did Scream Queens, which is kind of based off of all of these old slasher films and the Scream movie. Because what Scream did is it towed the line because it was. We talked about this on an old episode. One of those like subgenres where it's satirical, but it's also actual. Like it is a horror movie, but it's also poking at old slashers and horror movies, which is for me the extra layer of the movie that makes it interesting. It's not just a guy in a knife or with a knife.
That's true.
It plays off of the tropes actively and lets you know it's doing it, but still gives you a little bit of a curveball here and there that you're like, oh, this was a pretty good movie. I
But
think
if
they
a
were
movie
good.
is making fun of something and is still ultimately the same thing that it is, I don't like. It's like a little credit where credit's due, but not that much. This is my opinion. I don't know.
That's fair. No, that's fair. And granted, a lot of the slashers aren't going to take that much thought. Now I know that with like
we didn't talk
like
about Saw. Saw belongs in this category too.
Sure.
Saw. So I think there is a category we didn't put on here, and I think they're gore movies, and I think that's really more what those are because they're not. They're building the suspense because you're like, are they going to get out? Who's going to die?
You know what I
How
call
are they
this
going to die?
category kind of in my head? Is I call this category like, this is the movie that you took your girlfriend to go see when you were in like high school.
No.
Slasher
No.
films?
I don't know.
Yes.
That feels pretty accurate to me.
Slashers, yes. I thought you meant,
Slasher films like
I thought you meant,
Scream,
gore
I Know What You
films.
Did Last Summer, all those like those are the films you took
Yeah,
your girlfriend to
those
go
were.
see. Like
And
when you were in high school,
go,
dude. Like that's
when
Yeah.
you go and then you scream and everybody thinks it's your girlfriend screaming, you get laughed at for the next 5 years of
well,
your
that's
life.
you. That's you. Okay, you had that problem. The rest of us were fine.
I don't even know what the scene
You
was.
screamed
but
louder
we were
than
watching,
your girlfriend. Yes, I know.
Yeah, we were watching I Know What You Did Last Summer, and something about it just startled the living shit out of me, and I screamed, and it was I
Man.
never let it down. So I'm owning it at this point, but it was fucking hilarious.
Respect.
It was one of the times where we didn't get kicked out of a movie theater.
Oh God.
We'll talk about that.
This is
another
why we
time.
sit far away from people.
Yeah. We spread out, people. If you're sneaking into a movie theater, spread out.
Don't sit together
in one row.
That's how they get you.
So I have a question. I'm gonna back up a little bit because I think this is an interesting question. So psychological and sci-fi and that kind of stuff, which we'll talk about sci-fi here in a minute. I'm going to go a little out of order. But like what do you feel about like movies like oh Jesus, what's it called? I just had it. Um Christopher Nolan is a prime example of the director. Um
Uh,
Inception. It's
mm,
an action movie, but it is psychological, obviously to a pretty large degree. It's not, I don't know that I would call that a
not
horror
No,
movie,
it's not
but
horror.
it toes the line. Like it's like
mm,
if this
okay.
orange thing is horror movies, I'd put it like right here just because it holds some of the elements that we've talked about in psychological messing with your head and like characters kind of losing it, especially
True.
you know, his
Sure.
dead wife and all that
But
stuff.
I
It's
would say even in
interesting.
that sense, you can put something like Memento in that like category
Yeah.
too,
Mm,
like right there on that
yeah.
line. But it's not horror.
We're
It's
No.
just
we're
strong
we're
psychological elements.
we're getting off the track here. Let's we got a
Oh, but
lot of
that's
things to
the
do.
yeah. So monster movies. We'll go into monster movies because those I
Yeah.
think will be a little bit quicker. Maybe not, but like the ones we have are It, The Blob, Tremors, Frankenstein, and then you could obviously put like vampire movies in there and zombie movies in there, but they kind of spawned their own subgenre of movies. You know, but like werewolf movies, like those kinds of classic universal monster movies, the Creature from the Black Lagoon, like that kind of stuff. I think and obviously there's Mimic and like all these other ones that toe the line, like Alien and Predator, can also again be put into sci-fi or you know horror or whatever movies, sci-fi movies, but they also still kind of are monster movies when you get down to the core of it. There is an otherworldly creature that is causing chaos and havoc. And again, even like It, I think is also toes the line because it deals with the psyche as well, but it is an entity and a creature or a monster in this case, if you will, in that
Would you put like
regard.
Candyman in this?
Good one.
Possibly.
Either that or like closer to like a slasher.
Hard to
I
say,
don't know.
right?
That's a rough one.
It's like I said. That's kind of what sparked this whole episode. Is like these finer points. Is like where do you put these movies? There's so many subgenres and everything. So
I personally feel that monster movies aren't given. They're hard to market to people.
They are very
and
hard to market.
And I think that because of that fact, like it's hard to get an audience, and
Mhm.
which is a true shame because unfortunately some of these don't really. I mean, It and the Blob. They're. I mean, the Blob was the first.
fifties or something.
Wasn't the Blob the first movie to make like over $1 million at the box office? I feel like it was.
It's
Um,
possible.
so it's too bad because to me, monster movies, I feel like that's something I want more of as a horror
Oh, yeah.
fan. Something we don't get enough of, and because there's a lot of mystery surrounding them, and you don't really know what's happening some of the time. And I think it's, I mean, you could, you know, I mean, I'm going to get into Alien, which is technically sci-fi, but is also a monster movie, and that's
Yeah.
one of my all-time favorites. That I'm thinking of two movies that I saw. I watch a lot of like horror movies, and some of the ones that I've seen, like some of my favorites, even though as a movie they're not always great. Horror as a genre, you got to lower your bar if you're a horror fan, and that's just the reality of it most of the time. We're talking about some of the best right here, but if you're consistent looking for horror movies, it's hard to find. And I found a couple of good ones. There was one I saw called Antlers, and that was about something called the Wendigo. Which is like a Native American thing.
Wendigo.
Yeah, exactly. But it was super scary, and there was also something that you guys won't ever watch because you guys don't like horror movies as much. But there's something called The Ritual, and it was completely this monster was one of the craziest looking things I've seen in cinema. It was one of the most unique, scary. I couldn't even like my mind couldn't even wrap around my head around what I was seeing in this movie called The Ritual, and it's a great horror movie. You're not really sure what's happening, and it is psychological. It is monster. It is a little bit of paranormal, and I love. I mean, we talk about this a lot. Some of the best movies, and even like within the horror genre, some of the best ones will grab from multiple subgenres, and that's what this movie did. And I love monster movies. I wish we had more of them.
Yeah, yeah. George,
I don't have much to say about monster movies.
that's fine.
That's fair.
That's fine. I think some of these.
It's interesting. Just a quick note. It's interesting to even distinguish monster movies like Godzilla and like King Kong away from this, because those are not horror films per se, but they're considered monster movies, which is kind of weird.
It's true. You're not wrong.
So when you say monster movies, people have a weird concept of it, even outside of horror, right? Like it's an umbrella that covers other types of things that are not horror.
Okay, this is a weird question. Not weird, but did any of you see the Tom Cruise Mummy remake?
Yeah, I think so.
I passed on that one.
I watched it because I was like, I'm just feeling a Tom Cruise movie, and let's check it out. Not great, but if you separate it from what we know as the Mummy, which holds a lot of nostalgia for a lot of people, it's an interesting concept that they did, because they were originally, the idea was to make a Universal monster universe. And so like you had some interesting characters. You had Jekyll and Hyde. You had, you're introducing like werewolves and vampires a little bit in like in the shadows and all that shit. But like it was a very interesting, and I was like, I think this would have been a really cool concept had they done a couple more, but it just did so bad, because it really did just fall into like the Tom Cruise movie, which is its own category nowadays, at least. And so it felt too much like that. But overall, I mean, it was an interesting movie, and if you're intrigued by like a setup movie for like a universe that unfortunately we're not going to get, it might be worth checking out just to kind of see, because if you like Tom Cruise movies, it's not bad, by any means. It's not Mummy. It's like Ethan Hunt chases mummies. You know what I mean? Like it's
your mission, should you choose to accept it.
Yeah. So, but it was interesting. So, but like that kind of stuff, like I do wish they would do more things with those Universal monsters, that I think would be a very, very cool idea to do, because they did it with Godzilla and King Kong. There's a shared universe there, whether you like them or not. They're spectacular looking in certain scenes, but I think I do want more like monster movies. So speaking of monster, there are two subgenres of that, which are going to be zombie and vampire, because a lot of those came from a monster movie back in the day, and then spawned so many within their genre that they became their own little category. So I know I went on a zombie movie marathon back in like 2013. I spent a summer and I watched as many as I could possibly find. I mean, good ones, bad ones, Reanimator, all the Dawn of the Dead's, all the Romeros, Evil Dead's, all of those. But I mean, there's few that stand out, because they're not always, for me, scary. In fact, most of the time they're not. The only time I was like felt anything was like the premiere of The Walking Dead, when like they did a great job of him walking through the hospital in like pitch black, walking up and down the stairs, and he kept flicking the lighter on. It just really built suspense. And you're like, oh, they just talk for the next 8 seasons. But I love the idea of these zombie movies, because they lean into like the gore side of it, because they usually see people eating things and it's gross, and you do get like a pop scare every now and then, but like something about the story of usually a post-apocalyptic world and how one would fight and overcome zombies. It's just cool for me. Like I picture all of us doing that, and obviously we would all die fairly quickly, because none of us are like, let's do it. But unless we find ourselves in like a solid brick building, we probably wouldn't survive too very long. But to be able to map it out, I think it's cool. But like we've got on here Dawn of the Dead, 28 Days Later, World War Z, I Am Legend, and Train to Busan. And if you haven't seen Train to Busan, definitely check that one out. It's a fairly non-stop, high-paced Korean zombie flick that takes place mostly on a train, and it's it's cool. They build the tension. If you're into zombie movies,
So is it like
and haven't seen it.
Snowpiercer with zombies?
Kinda, yeah, pretty much. But it's a very good, especially if you're into like Korean movies as well. Like I know Korean dramas and everything are real big, but like it's a very nice piece of film and cinematography and design and a fresh take on an otherwise overly played concept, especially since The Walking Dead. But Dan doesn't like zombie movies. Go ahead.
I don't like any of these movies. I don't. The only thing I like, so I will say, The Walking Dead. Initially, I was into that. Went away more quickly than most. For me, I don't get it. My favorite zombie movies are in order: Zombieland and Shaun of the Dead, because they make fun of the movies and they deserve it, in my opinion. I don't know. I don't get it. It's the same thing over and over again, and it's a lot of, and the same thing with vampire movies. Apart from Interview with a Vampire, I'm over it all. It's these things, that these points in pop culture that have, people kind of like, they ebb and flow, and they like there's an obsession of them, and it kind of dies down, and it kind of comes back because they're sexy again or something. Like, let's make a movie where someone falls in love with a vampire or falls in love with a zombie, and then it's like, all right, let's die back up again. Like, it's just, I'm over it. Like, I don't like, if you're gonna do it, you got to do something. You got to reinvent like what it means to be a vampire or a zombie. And no one really cares to do that. So it's just more of the same over and over again. So with that, I will pass.
Sure. George?
I like them in the sense that like I said, I feel like they're one of the more realistic types of horror to happen. It's that category. There are obviously a wide scale of good zombie films and bad zombie films. It's a very wide.
Yes.
Yeah. So
I like the what's his name? Zack Snyder did the remake of Dawn of the Dead, and I still to this day think that's his best movie ever, because it is a movie, and it is not a slow motion ad for ass and tits.
There's
like,
also
it's a movie.
I mean, but the thing is like, I think that's the thing, is because of the way the zombie movies are. I think like, and just the way that it's fallen into that kind of Hollywood churn that Dan was talking about a little bit earlier. They kind of paint themselves in a corner. Do you know what I'm saying?
They do.
They paint themselves in the corner because audiences are expecting a certain thing from that genre, and they're going to do it. And that's why you have things like franchises like that that seem to sputter, like Walking Dead, and also, of course, Resident Evil, where it's like, dang, dude, they still making this. She's still going. Like,
they rebooted it.
She's still going. Like, you're like, okay, I guess. Like, here we go. Like,
I would say that the
wide range.
You're right. Like, if you look at this list, it kind of almost, I mean, it's a little out of order, but like Dawn of the Dead or Day of the Dead, the original Romero's, for their time, probably were very scary, because it not only, the first one, not only dealt with zombies, it dealt a lot with like race issues in America, which is just like, oh, this is huge. Okay, cool.
I do want to say that of their time on their release as their own thing, I think those movies deserve all the credit in the world, and I didn't get to say that.
28 Days is really good too.
But to me, it's almost as if like we had like a pick a monster. Like, imagine like any one of these monsters getting the attention that vampires or zombies have had. I feel like we just like, wow, another Blob movie, another movie where people just start randomly like, oh, this, but it is sexy, and we've fallen in love with it. You know what I mean? It just, I don't get it. I don't know why. I appreciate. I think because zombies and vampires are there's. It seems. I get the whole like zombie seems like it could happen kind of thing, and it could. It's just done to death, it's done at the same kind of like intervals and the same kind of like how you, it's the same. It's the same.
If you look at it, like, you got the originals, the Days and Dawns, and then in like probably not until the 90s or whatever when they did 28 Days Later. Like that changed zombies because zombies were lethargic and slow, and then suddenly you got these ones that can run, and you're like, okay, now there's a new take on it. So that kind of refreshed it again, like you said.
Yeah.
And then World War Z, I just put it on there because I couldn't think of a ton of A-list type zombie movies. But like, I think I Am Legend kind of started that kind of shift for when it did to a more dramatic aspect where it's not about the zombies, it's about the interpersonal relationships that you have in a post-apocalyptic world while surviving, which then spawned things like The Walking Dead, which was I think already out as a comic by then, but also things like Last of Us, which is arguably one of the best technically zombie stories ever told because again it focuses on the relationships and the people and survival within a zombie world. So there are I know you forgot about it. I know.
Because I don't think it was a zombie
I know.
movie. You know what I mean? It's mostly about like the
Yeah.
relation. Yeah. Anyway,
The game is very much a zombie horror game.
Yeah.
The show is not, and it's a whole. We talked about it. Go watch it. Check it out. We had a lot of long conversations about that. But they did kind of get reinvented, and then things like Shaun of the Dead and Warm Bodies and Zombieland all started to kind of appear. Where you're like, this is ridiculous. Let's like, what else can we do? And then now it's making fun of, falling in love with, and doing all that stuff. Which they have their moments, but let's get into your favorites then, Dan. We've got, sci-fi and paranormal coming up.